How does a company win the highest honors in its industry for 6 consecutive years and then disappear? It is a question that defies logic and challenges everything we think we know about the stability of the global market. Picture a towering glass skyscraper reflecting the morning sun, a symbol of absolute power and progress. This was not just a business. It was an institution that seemed destined to define the coming century. For 72 months, the world watched in awe as this corporate titan collected every prize and broke every record. Yet behind the dark, high-contrast, corporate graphics of its marketing campaigns, a betrayal was festering. The boundary between public prestige and absolute ruin is far more fragile than anyone dares to admit. When that boundary finally shatters, the shards cut deep, leaving nothing but questions and empty offices in their wake. The rise was nothing short of meteoric. In the early years, the growth curves looked like something out of a science fiction novel, climbing vertical and relentless. Every quarterly report was a victory lap. The media coverage was glowing, painting a picture of a company that could do no wrong. They were the darlings of the financial press, featured on every magazine cover from London to Tokyo. Award ceremonies became routine events where the CEO would walk across the stage to thunderous applause, accepting statues of crystal and gold. These were not just executives. They were visionary icons worshipped by the market. Investors did not just put their money into the company, they put their faith in it. There was an absolute, unquestioning trust from the general public. If the company said they had revolutionized a new sector, the world believed them. If the experts questioned the speed of their expansion, they were dismissed as relics of an older, slower era. Flawless public relations campaigns created a reality where failure was considered an impossibility. Everyone believed the cover story. The narrative was so polished, so bright, that it blinded the very people whose job it was to look closer. We saw a world-changing innovator, while the reality was far more complex and dangerous. To understand how this happened, we must look past the bright lights and the rehearsed speeches. We must adopt a detached, investigative, and cold analytical lens to examine the mechanics of this massive illusion. In the world of high finance, prestige acts as a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the senses of regulators and dulls the instincts of financial analysts. When a brand becomes synonymous with success, it gains a sort of institutional immunity. The branding was so strong that it actively blinded the official watchdogs. Why would a regulator investigate a company that is being celebrated by the Prime Minister or the President? Why would an analyst suggest a sell-off when every other professional is screaming to buy? Prestige delayed skepticism for 6 long years. The company used its reputation like a shield, deflecting any genuine inquiry with a smile and a fresh round of impressive, though vague, data points. They mastered the art of being perceived as too successful to fail, creating a feedback loop where their previous awards justified their future promises. This was not just a business strategy. It was a psychological operation played out on a global scale. The market wanted to believe in a miracle, and the company was more than happy to provide the performance. But the thing about illusions is that they require perfection to survive. Even the smallest flaw can cause the entire image to stutter. The first cracks did not appear on a grand stage or in a public confrontation. They appeared in the dry, dense pages of the Q6 financial reports. These documents were designed to be boring, to be skimmed over by exhausted interns and forgotten in a digital archive. However, an anonymous insider began to see things differently. This employee, hidden deep within the corporate structure, started to notice a pattern that did not make sense. It was a pattern of narrative manipulation rather than real innovation. While the public heard about breakthroughs, the internal data spoke of stagnation and creative accounting. The anonymous insider realized that the multi-billion-dollar foundation was built on something much softer than concrete. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The tension inside the headquarters began to rise, even as the exterior remained calm and professional. A single unglamorous data leak, a simple spreadsheet sent to the wrong person, now threatened to expose everything. Success had become the camouflage for a disaster waiting to happen. The 6-year streak was about to meet a reality that no amount of branding could hide. The anonymous insider sat at a desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in their eyes, holding the key to a collapse that would shake the entire financial world. The data was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the world to wake up from its collective dream. This was the moment the dream started to turn into a nightmare, as the first piece of the puzzle was pulled away from the wall. Success narratives are often strongest right before they fall apart, and the foundation of this empire was already turning to dust. One single truth was about to collide with a mountain of lies. The world was still celebrating the icon, unaware that the countdown to zero had already begun in the shadows of the boardroom. As the night grew darker, the anonymous insider hit the send button, and the first wave of a tidal wave was set in motion. The image was still standing, but the truth was finally moving. The shift began not with a loud bang, but with a suffocating change in the air inside the glass walls of the headquarters. As the data leaked by the anonymous insider began to circulate in the dark corners of the financial world, the atmosphere of corporate awe curdled into something far more clinical and cold. The investigation was no longer about profit margins or market share. It became a psychological autopsy of a dying giant. Beneath the polished public image that the world had worshipped for 72 months, a highly toxic internal culture was finally being dragged into the light. For 6 years, employees had lived in a state of perpetual high pressure, where the only thing more dangerous than failing was questioning the methods of the CEO. It was an environment built on a foundation of fear, where the 6-year winning streak was treated like a religious dogma that could never be challenged. Behind the scenes, the manipulation of numbers had reached a fever pitch of desperation. To keep the streak alive and maintain the illusion of consistent growth, the executive team had resorted to a complex dance of shadows. They were not just exaggerating their successes, they were inventing them. In the quiet offices of the accounting department, the pressure to make the math fit the narrative had become unbearable. The CEO would demand results that defied the laws of economics, forcing staff to move phantom funds and delay the reporting of massive losses. Every quarterly celebration was preceded by weeks of frantic secret adjustments. The image of the visionary icon was being propped up by 1,000 small lies, each one more precarious than the last. This was the breaking point where the dream of innovation collided with the reality of fraud. As the leaked documents from the Q6 report reached the hands of independent journalists and rogue analysts, the exposure of inconsistencies became an unstoppable force. These were people who were not intimidated by the prestige of the brand or the charisma of its leader. They began to connect the dots that the official watchdogs had ignored for over half a decade. The rogue analysts noticed that the numbers in the leaked report did not just show a slowdown, they revealed a mathematical impossibility. While the official narrative spoke of 100% efficiency, the raw data suggested that the company was bleeding capital at an alarming rate. Independent journalists began to knock on doors that had been locked for years, finding former employees who were finally willing to speak about the culture of silence. The friction between the executive cover-ups and the mathematical reality grew until it could no longer be contained by public relations campaigns. Inside the boardroom, the silent tension was thick enough to feel. The CEO sat at the head of the long obsidian table, surrounded by advisors who were now looking at their own reflections with visible doubt. The confident smiles that had defined the last 6 years had vanished, replaced by the grim realization that the walls were closing in. Every time a new report was published by the independent press, the pressure inside the room increased. There were no more jokes, No more celebratory toasts, only the frantic tapping of keyboards and the hushed tones of lawyers discussing damage control. The executive panic was no longer a secret kept behind closed doors. It was beginning to leak into every internal communication and every emergency meeting. The mask of the market icon was slipping, revealing a man who was terrified of the very monster he had created. The dominoes began to fall when the institutional partners sensed the immediate danger. These were the heavy hitters, the banks and investment firms that had provided the fuel for the company's meteoric rise. They were the first to see the cracks and the first to realize that the prestige they had bought into was a hollow shell. Quietly, without making any public announcements, they began to pull their capital out. Millions of dollars were moved in the middle of the night, a silent exodus of the smart money that preceded the coming storm. The market, which had once been a source of endless support, was now beginning to turn. The media narrative, once filled with sycophantic praise, began a slow and calculated pivot. The same news outlets that had put the CEO on their covers were now preparing segments on the suspicious nature of the company's sudden silence. The final facade did not just crack, it shattered in front of a global audience. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the news broke that a major regulatory investigation had been officially launched. The announcement was made live on television, with the faces of regulators appearing on every screen in the financial hub. They spoke of systemic irregularities and a pattern of deception that spanned the entire 6-year period of the company's dominance. The world watched in stunned silence as the institution they had trusted was branded as a fraud. The prestige that had acted as a shield for so long was gone in an instant, replaced by a wave of intense scrutiny that no amount of branding could deflect. As the cameras gathered at the front entrance of the corporate headquarters, a different scene was unfolding at the back. The CEO, the man who had been celebrated as the future of the industry, was not standing at a podium to defend his legacy. Instead, he was fleeing through a service exit, his face obscured by a dark coat as he rushed toward a waiting car. He refused to answer the shouted questions of the few journalists who had anticipated his escape. The flashes of the cameras illuminated his hurried retreat, capturing the image of a fallen icon in full flight. Behind him, the glass building stood like a monument to a lie that had finally been exposed. The image had survived longer than the truth, but the time for illusions had run out. The sun began to set on the city, and a heavy silence fell over the markets. Everyone knew that the reprieve was temporary. The image was broken, the leader was gone, and tomorrow morning the markets would open to a reality that no one was prepared to face. The countdown to the final collapse had reached its final seconds, and the world was left waiting for the first bell to ring. The opening bell of the stock exchange usually sounds like a signal of opportunity, a rhythmic pulse that marks the beginning of another day of growth and ambition. But on this Wednesday morning, the bell rang with the cold, final resonance of a funeral knell. For 6 years, the markets had treated this company as an untouchable titan, a beacon of stability that seemed to defy the gravity of the global economy. Now, as the first trades were executed, that gravity returned with a devastating vengeance. Within the first 90 seconds of trading, the stock price did not just dip, it plummeted through every support level that analysts had calculated over the last decade. It was a digital slaughter, a sea of flickering red numbers that moved so fast the human eye could barely track the destruction of wealth. In less than 60 minutes, the stock price, which had once reached a staggering peak of $240 per share, crashed past the $50 mark and showed no signs of stopping. By midday, the value of the firm was effectively zero. $5 billion in market capitalization had evaporated into the digital ether, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of public trust. The institutional partners, who had begun their silent exodus the night before, were the only ones who had escaped the initial blast. For the everyday citizens and small investors who had believed in the 6-year winning streak, there was no exit. They watched their life savings disappear in real time, staring at screens in a state of paralyzed disbelief. The prestige that had once made the company look like a fortress was now revealed to be nothing more than a hollow shell designed to protect those at the top while the foundation rotted. The media outlets that had spent 72 months building the altar of this corporate icon were the first to tear it down. The pivot was instantaneous and brutal. News anchors, who had once competed for a few minutes of airtime with the CEO, were now narrating his downfall with a tone of practiced moral outrage. They spoke of the warning signs they had supposedly seen all along, rewriting the history of their own sycophantic coverage in a matter of hours. The glowing documentaries and award ceremonies were replaced by high-definition footage of the back exit, where the CEO had fled the day before. His legacy was being dismantled in the public square, transformed from a story of visionary innovation into a cautionary tale of greed and systemic deception. The very institutions that had helped build the legend were now the most aggressive in ensuring its complete destruction. Inside the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was eerie and suffocating. The glass walls that had once reflected the vibrant energy of a world-class business now felt like the walls of a mausoleum. The obsidian table in the boardroom, where the executive team had calculated their 1,000 small lies, was covered in a thin layer of dust and abandoned tablets. There were no more frantic meetings or whispered secrets. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning units that continued to cool a building that was now functionally empty. Employees wandered the halls like ghosts, carrying boxes of personal belongings while avoiding eye contact with one another. The sense of betrayal was not just professional, it was deeply personal. They had sacrificed years of their lives to a narrative that they now realized was a fabrication, a collective delusion maintained by a culture of fear and manufactured success. As the sun began to set on the first day of the collapse, the psychological weight of the event began to settle over the financial hub. This was not just a business failure, it was a crisis of faith. The anonymous insider, who had started this landslide with a single leak of the Q6 financial reports, watched from a distance as the lights in the upper floors of the headquarters were turned off for the last time. The data had proven what the world was too blinded by prestige to see, that the math never added up. The system itself had cultivated this illusion, providing the awards, the positive press, and the regulatory silence that allowed the rot to spread. It was a reminder that prestige is not proof of value, and a high-profile reputation can often be the most effective camouflage for total ruin. The strategic takeaways from this collapse are chilling in their simplicity. We live in an era where the narrative often carries more weight than the reality, where the image of success is guarded more fiercely than the integrity of the work itself. The lesson of the 6-year streak is that sustainable value cannot be built on a foundation of narrative manipulation. True innovation does not require the frantic hiding of losses or the silencing of dissent. The same mechanisms that build these massive corporate legends are the ones that make their eventual fall so catastrophic. When the market values the story more than the substance, it creates a bubble of belief that can only end in a violent burst. The institutions that are supposed to protect the public often become the very architects of the deception, blinded by the same prestige they are meant to monitor. The definitive psychological truth of this downfall is that success narratives are often at their strongest and most convincing right before they collapse. We are drawn to icons, to the idea of the lone visionary who can do no wrong, and that desire to believe makes us complicit in the lie. The warning signs were never truly hidden. They were simply ignored because the truth was less comfortable than the legend. The Q6 reports, the toxic culture, And the mathematical inconsistencies were all there, waiting for someone like the anonymous insider to bring them to the light. But for 6 years, the world chose to look at the awards and the rising stock prices instead of the cracks in the glass. Now, as the empty corporate headquarters stands as a dark monument against the city skyline, the final reflection remains for us to consider. A cracked institutional symbol hangs over the entrance, a logo that once represented the pinnacle of achievement and now serves as a reminder of an overnight ruin. The story of this company is a warning that will be studied for decades, but the patterns will likely repeat. We are often more in love with the feeling of success than the reality of it, and as long as that remains true, the next icon is already being built on a foundation of sand. The warning signs are always there, whispering beneath the noise of the celebratory toasts and the flashing cameras. The only question is whether we will have the courage to listen before the next bell rings. In the end, the image survived only as long as the truth was kept in the dark, and once the light hit the center of the machine, there was nothing left to see. The legend was gone, leaving only the cold reality of the morning after.